So, happy Father's Day to the father who fixed their kid's car 5 times. Pray for new cars for your family. That's pretty incredible. And for some of us in this room, we got an early Father's Day gift last night with the hockey game. It was kind of a miracle for Edmonton, so we'll see what happens there. So we are continuing in our series through the Gospel of Mark, and we've called this series Amazing Grace, because as we've studied it, we've seen over and over again the grace of God coming in miraculous ways. Last week, we looked at the identity of Jesus, and we saw how the first time Jesus identifies himself as the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Son of God. And as the Son of God, he makes this sort of strange prediction about himself to his disciples. He says that he's going to suffer, he's going to be rejected, he's going to be killed, and then he's going to rise again. And this leads Peter to tell Jesus that's not going to happen. And Jesus turns to Peter and rebukes him. And this leads us to our passage today. So if you have your Bibles with you or your devices, please open them up to Mark chapter 9, and we're going to be looking at verses 2 to 8 this morning. Mark 9, 2 to 8. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So as we work through this passage, we're going to look at 3 things: the transfiguration, Peter's confusion, and then finally, Jesus alone. So let's start by looking at the transfiguration. Verse 2 says, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him, led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. So Jesus takes these 3 men and he leads them to this place of solitude. And I just think this is a beautiful picture of Jesus taking them so that they were all alone. It's just them and Jesus. And it's something we can learn in our own lives, of creating places and spaces in our daily rhythm, in our weekly rhythm, where Jesus can take us just to be alone with him. And it's in this place of solitude, it's in this place of aloneness that this miraculous transfiguration happens. And I want us to see 4 things that take place here. First of all, there's a change in Jesus' appearance. Then there's an appearance of Elijah and Moses. Then there's a cloud, and then there's a voice. So let's work through these elements one by one. First of all, it says Jesus' clothes became white. Now, this story of the transfiguration is found in all 3 of the Gospels, and they add a little bit of a variation to what happened. Matthew says his face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Luke says the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became bright as a flash of lightning. So there's this physical, visible transformation of intense glory emanating out of Jesus. And this glory is communicated through a face that is glowing and through whites that are through clothes that are really, really a bright white. And as we work through this passage, we're going to be looking back at another passage in Scripture, because there's allusions here to when Moses is on the mountain and also when Elijah is on a mountain. So if we look back at Moses has this incredible opportunity to ascend Mount Sinai, and he's in conversation with God, and God is giving him the laws for all of Israel. And it says in Exodus 34 that when Moses came down from the mountain, he didn't know that his face was actually shining, that there was a glow coming off of him. And it says that Moses would have to wear a veil over his face so that the people could speak with him, and then he'd take the veil off when meeting with God. So what was happening was Moses was spending this time alone with God, and as he's doing that, the glory of God is coming onto Moses, and then he comes down off the mountain, and that glory is actually reflecting off of Moses. Now, here's the difference between Moses and Jesus. Moses is receiving the glory from God, and then when he comes down, that glory is reflected out to everyone else. Now, the difference here is that the glory from Jesus is coming from within him. And this is an affirmation, and it's a testimony of the divinity of Jesus, that Jesus is God and Jesus is glory. So the first thing we see is there's this physical transformation, this visible transformation of brightness coming off of Jesus. The second thing that happens is the appearance of Elijah and Moses, which is like pretty weird, right? These guys just show up out of nowhere and they're talking to Jesus. Now, it's very, very interesting. Of the people that are chosen from the Old Testament, one is Moses and one is Elijah. Now, Moses was a prophet, he was a liberator, and he was a leader. And he was the person to whom the law of God was dictated to. So without Moses, we wouldn't have the 10 Commandments. Without Moses, we wouldn't have the parameters of law and of morality that we need to live our lives by. So Moses represents the law of God. Now, Elijah was this amazing prophet of God. If you study the life of Elijah, you see acts of power happening over and over again. In 1 Kings 17, just in this one chapter, he says, there will be neither dew nor rain except at my word. And so he has God's power to control the weather. He shapes history through the power of his words. Through Elijah, God provides miraculously bread and oil to a widow and her son. Through Elijah, God's power flows where the widow's son is actually raised from the dead. And so you have Moses, the lawgiver, and then you have Elijah representing power and righteousness. So law and revelation coming in conversation with Jesus. So you have the change in his clothing, his glowing face. You have Moses and Elijah. And then in verse 7, a cloud appeared and covered them. A cloud appeared and covered them. When Moses is on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, it says that thunder, lightning, and there was a thick cloud over the mountain. And if you study the Old Testament, you start to see a correlation between clouds and God. 1 Kings 8:12, Solomon said, the Lord has said he would dwell in a dark cloud. Psalm 18:11-12, he made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced. And so when God is portrayed as a warrior, the clouds are his battle chariots in which he travels. Dark clouds overshadow the judgment day of Yahweh, which the prophets announced. And so clouds are used here symbolically to show again the revelation of the lordship of Jesus Christ. So the cloud on the mountain is a powerful and visceral confirmation that Jesus is endowed with divine power. So you have the change in his clothing, the changes in his appearance, Moses and Elijah, you have the clouds, and then you have the voice of God. Verse 7, a voice from the cloud. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Both Elijah and Moses had been on mountains at different times, and both of them had heard the voice of God. And do you see how now all the aspects that were there of God communicating with humanity, of a mountain, of clouds, and of a voice are here again? And so we looked a little bit at Moses' encounter with God, but Elijah's encounter with God on a mountain you might not be as familiar with. And we need to set the context this. In 1 Kings 18, there's a very dramatic power encounter between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. So what's been happening is that this worship of Baal, this cult, has become very, very powerful. And Elijah wants to show Israel that it's Yahweh, it's God, the God of Israel is the real and living God. And so in 1 Kings 18, we read things like this. Elijah goes and says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. And then what happens is there's this sort of divine showdown where Elijah tells the prophets of Baal, okay, you guys set up an altar, you put a bull there, I'm going to set up an altar, I'm going to put a bull there, and whichever God answers by fire and consumes the offering, then we will know that it was God. The God who answers by fire, he is God. And so this is what happens. The prophets do all that. They call on the name of Baal from morning to noon. Baal, answer us. There was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, this is where I really start to like Elijah, because he starts to make fun of them. Shout louder. He's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. So they shouted louder. They slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. No response. No one answered. No one paid attention. And so Elijah says, okay, now it's my time. And so they build the altar. They do all that. And then he does something interesting. He says, fill 4 large jars with water. Pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again. Do it a third time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. And then Elijah prays this beautiful prayer. He says, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and I'm your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and you're turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and licked up the water in the trench. All the people saw this. They fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let them get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered them there. So all this happens. This is like a great victory for God. So when you read that, I think Elijah should get a big reward, right? Instead, the very next chapter says this. Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Jezebel's the queen. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like that of one of them. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely. Basically, she's saying, look, if you're not dead by tomorrow, then I am in deep trouble. So this is the context where Elijah is now going to hear the voice of God. All this has happened, and he's tired, and he's distraught, and he's scared. And he lets God knows it. He gets to the mountain, and he goes into a cave, and he says, I've been so zealous for you, God. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars. They put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. So Elijah has come to this moment, come to the mountain in complete devastation. He's saying, look, God, Israel has rejected you. They've torn down your altar. They want nothing to do with you. They've killed your prophets. I've been zealous for you, and now they're trying to kill me too. He comes to God so broken and so distraught, and he says, Is this it? Is this the end of your global plan of redemption? Are your covenants with Moses and Abraham coming to an end? What about all those prophecies? Is that all over? And so this is the voice of God that comes to Elijah. He says, go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king of Israel. Anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Mahola, to succeed you as prophet. So Elijah is looking at the world, and he's like, it's over. The project of redemption is over. I'm the only one left, and they're going to kill me. And God says to him, go back the way that you came, which is like, wow, I just came from there running for my life, and you want me to go back to that? Go back to where you came, and look what's going to happen. 3 new leaders are going to emerge. You are going to anoint 2 kings, and you're going to anoint a prophet, and my project of redemption is going to continue throughout history. Israel is saved, and the world is saved, because on the mountain of God, the voice of God came to the man of God. And Elijah took that and did what God said to do. So Moses is given the law, and Elijah is given the plan. This is the voices of God that come to these 2 men on the mountain. But there's a radical difference between what God says to Moses and to Elijah and what he says on the mountain in this encounter. The voice of God to Moses was instructional. He's communicating his law and his will to the people of Israel through Moses. The voice of God to Elijah is also instructional. He's guiding and encouraging Elijah to keep going, to fulfill his calling. And now what does the voice of God say? This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. This is my son whom I have chosen. This is my son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to my son. Listen to Jesus. And this tells us that we don't need this. Now we have Jesus giving us direct revelation. Jesus is going to be the voice of God in our lives now. Jesus Christ is not merely a prophet. Jesus Christ is not merely a religious teacher. Jesus Christ is not even the founder of a new religion. We come to the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And this statement, this belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, is the primary demarcation of belief for the Christian. No matter where you are this morning as we gather together, it comes down to what you will do about Jesus, what you will believe about Jesus. And Christianity comes down to this truth and to this reality that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that Jesus Christ lived a sinless life of moral perfection, and Jesus Christ was crucified to a Roman cross, and Jesus Christ really physically died. And 3 days later, Jesus Christ really rose from the dead and launched the greatest movement in human history. I was in a Facebook conversation with a group of pastors from around the world this past week, and the question was asked, what do you love to preach on? And I immediately responded, the cross. I love preaching on the cross, and I'll never be able to completely plunge the depths of the meaning of the cross. We are people of the cross, and that's why we must listen to Jesus, and not just listen, but obey his teachings. And so that's the transfiguration. That's the bulk of my message. You're looking at the time, you're like, man, you better get going here. The last 2 points aren't as transfiguration. Now, Peter's confusion. So Jesus has undergone this dramatic transformation. Elijah and Moses show up out of nowhere, and Peter's like, what is going on? And you know that feeling when you know you should be doing something, but not really sure what to do, so you just do anything, which is kind of what Peter does here. Verse 5, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here, which I'm like, what are you talking about? You got Moses, Elijah. Why is it good that you're here? Like, you got the main people here. Good thing I'm here because I'm Peter. And Peter's contribution to this event, let's build something. Let's put up 3 shelters or 3 tents. We'll build one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So what's happening here is that Peter believes that there's a supernatural, spiritual event taking place. And he responds the only way he knows how. He responds actually in worship. Because in order to worship, we're going to need tabernacles. We're going to need places to go to worship. And what Peter does is what Christians have done throughout history, is when there's a remarkable move of God, we have this tendency to try to control it, to domesticate it, to try to exert some kind of control. What Peter should have done is what the voice said, is to listen to Jesus. And this is the important point I want you to get here, is there is a spiritual discipline of patience and of waiting. And we often get very impatient and frustrated when things are not progressing according to our timeline. And so we move ahead of God. In the Old Testament, God leads Israel out of Egypt and he guides them through the wilderness. And it says in Exodus 40, in all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted, they would set out. But if the cloud didn't lift, they didn't set out until it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, the fire was in the cloud by night. The Israelites did not travel until God directed them to do so. And some of you here this morning need to hear this. You're frustrated, you're impatient, you're angry with God about something. There's something in your life that is not as it should be, an errant child, an unfulfilled dream, and you're impatient with God. And the word for you today is to wait patiently. That God's ways are not our ways. God's timing is not our timing. You know, there's a line that I love, maybe one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. The Israelites have just been freed, and Pharaoh's like, what did I do? Let's go get them back. And he sends his army after them, and the army's coming down, bearing on them, and Israel's terrified. And listen to Moses, this voice of reason in the middle. Exodus 14:13. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Some of you are not still. You are restless. And God is saying, don't be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Transfiguration, Peter's confusion, finally, Jesus only. Verse 8, suddenly when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. When the voice had spoken, they saw that Jesus was alone. So I'm like, is this like some kind of fun party trick? Here they are. Now they're gone. Where'd they go? Let's go find them. But actually what's happening is this is a dramatic and powerful visual lesson. God is revealing to us something absolutely stunning about Jesus. Moses is no more. Elijah is no more. Jesus is there alone. Moses represents the law. Jesus is the final law. Elijah represents power. Jesus is the final power. We don't need man-made tabernacles like Peter wanted to build because Jesus is the tabernacle. All of the laws, all of the prophecies, all of the worship, everything the Jewish people had done to connect with God has now come to an end because Jesus alone. You know, those of us who've grown up in the church, I fear we may have built in sort of an immunity to how radical and how amazing Jesus Christ is. And it's like this part of the transfiguration is put in there to show us very, very powerfully that everything else will fade away and it will be just Jesus alone. Towards the end of the 20th century, British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge reflected back on the history that he had seen in his lifetime, and then he contextualized it against the person of Jesus. Muggeridge wrote these words, "We look back on history, and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions succeeding one another, wealth accumulating and wealth dispersed, one nation dominant and then another. As Shakespeare's King Lear puts it, the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. In one lifetime, I've seen my fellow countrymen ruling over a quarter of the world, and the great majority of them convinced, in the words of what is still a favorite song, that God has made them mighty and will make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed Austrian announce the establishment of a German Reich that was to last for 1,000 years. An Italian clown report that the calendar will begin again with his assumption of power. A murderous Georgian in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite as wiser than Solomon, more enlightened than Ashoka, more humane than Marcus Aurelius. I've seen America wealthier than all the rest of the world put together, and with the superiority of weaponry would have enabled Americans, had they so wished, to outdo an Alexander or Julius Caesar in the range and scale of conquest. Now listen to this. All in one lifetime, gone with the wind. England, now part of an island off the coast of Europe, threatened with further dismemberment. Hitler and Mussolini seen as buffoons. Stalin, a sinister name in the regime he helped to found and dominate for 3 decades. Americans haunted by fears of running out of the precious fluid that keeps their motorways roaring and the smog settling, by memories of a disastrous military campaign in Vietnam and the windmills of Watergate. Behind the debris of these solemn supermen and self-styled imperial diplomats, there stands the gigantic figure of one, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom alone mankind may still have peace. The person of Jesus Christ towers over all of history, the way, the truth. As he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me, for I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. So I pray as you go out into your week, you go out with that truth and that reality, that sin's curse has lost its grip on you. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, to him be the glory, both now and forevermore. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, God bless you. Have a great week.